Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a very interesting lecture. I'd like to welcome Professor Miriam Leonard when she offered to talk to us, and we asked her the topic, and I said, before I read up on her, I had the title of the lecture with me, which was Freud, Archaeology, Egypt, Greece, and Rome. When something like this ends up in my email, it gives me a bit of a jolt. And then, of course, I immediately, aren't we lucky we have this Google? And this beautiful lady turned up on my screen, and wow, what a biodata. And what erudite lectures she has given in her current role at University College, and earlier as well at Bristol University, and of course as a PhD student at Cambridge. So on behalf of all of us, our Director General, Mr. Sabyasachi Mukherjee, members of the Museum Society, trustees of the museum, welcome to the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangralaya. We just note it as CSMVS. So thank you very, very much for being with us today. It's an interesting lecture. It's a bit complicated, I think, but I'm sure Professor Leonard will join all the dots for us in a most interesting and, of course, erudite fashion. I also welcome her family in our midst, Professor Feroz Vasunya, who spoke to us last Monday on Sappho and ancient Sanskrit poets. And those of you who are not here, I was surprised to see how popular study of the Sanskrit language is amongst young scholars and people, because not only was the lecture very interesting, but the Q&A that followed was equally interesting. And do join us at the Q&A at the end of this talk. The Freud Museum in London is the final home of Sigmund Freud, founder of psychoanalysis, and his daughter Anna Freud, a pioneering child psychoanalyst who fled to London in 1938 after the Nazi invasion of Vienna. At the heart of the museum's display is actually Sigmund Freud's personal collection of over 3,000 antiquities, which were crucially important to the formulation of many of his key ideas, such as, we all know, students of literature, the Oedipus complex, and the concept of narcissism. Professor Leonard has curated a number of exhibitions exploring the significance of Freud's collection to the development of psychoanalysis. And this evening she will explore with us how archaeology impacted on Freud's theories of the mind, as well as analyzing the extent to which his collection of archaeological objects informed his perspectives on gender, sexuality, race, and the historical constitution of personal identity. I'm going to end there and say a few words about our esteemed speaker, a professor of Greek literature and its reception of University College London. Her research explores the intellectual history of classics in modern European thought from the 18th century to the present time. She is the author of several publications, but I'd like to point out a few: Athens and Paris, Ancient Greece, and How to Read Ancient Philosophy, Socrates and the Jews, Hellenism and Hebraism from Moses Mendelssohn to Sigmund Freud, all published at esteemed places like Chicago in 2012, Oxford in 2005, London in 2008, and The Tragic Modernites of Cambridge in 2015, Cambridge, Massachusetts. She was a curator of the 2019 exhibition, Freud and Egypt, and the 2023 exhibition, Freud's Antiquity, at the Freud Museum in London. Her latest book, which is forthcoming from the Chicago Press, is titled Revolution: Modern Uprisings in Ancient Time.
Okay, thank you so much. It's an enormous pleasure to be here tonight to talk to you in this incredible setting, and I'm incredibly honoured to have been offered this invitation to speak here tonight. I'm particularly grateful to Rosa Godrej for the invitation and also for her patience and kindness in helping us set up this evening. To the Museum Society, and also to, I'll take the invitation to use the acronym CSMVS for hosting me here tonight, and particularly also to the Director General for being here. My talk connects, I think, in some ways with the hugely inspiring Ancient World Gallery project that took place here, as it's sought to explore how a shared vision of global antiquity has impacted on our understanding of what it is to be human. This wonderful exhibition, which was co-curated by CSMVS, played such an important role in raising questions about how the history of world cultures should be presented in a museum context. And it's led the way to a discussion which I think should be happening in all museums around the world. And a version of this is certainly happening in other museums, for instance, in the British Museum in London, where there are big debates about the curation of the Elgin marbles and whether or not the Elgin marbles should be returned to Greece. There are obviously debates about things like the Koh-i-Noor diamond and where that should be displayed. But I think these debates about the ownership and the curation of the past are absolutely central to the big museums of the world, but also to the small museums. And I'm going to be talking to you today about such a small museum. So the centre of my talk is about, as I say, this small museum in London, which is the Freud Museum. And although the museum is about a 20th century figure, namely the founder of psychoanalysis, it also impacts on this question, the curation of ancient sculptures, and the issue of how one can make sense of world antiquities or notion of global antiquities. How can one make sense of the interaction between different ancient cultures? So let me start by telling you something about the Freud Museum in London. So here we have an outline of Freud's life, which I'll be returning to at various points in my talk, where you can see some of the kind of pointers of the different moments in his biography, which will relate to the museum, or as I'll reveal in a minute, museums that I'm going to be talking about. So this is the Freud Museum in London, and you might be wondering why the Austrian founder of psychoanalysis has his museum in London, right? So Sigmund Freud, an incredibly influential figure, the precursor of many of the kind of therapeutic approaches to mental health issues today, was working at the turn of the century between, if we go back here, he was born in 1856, died in 1939, so worked between the late 19th century and the early 20th century, and he was based for the majority of his working life in Vienna. Nevertheless, his museum is now located in the North London suburb of Hampstead, and it's a very British building. You can see a perfectly Victorian-age building with beautiful roses adorning its front garden, and really one couldn't be more at home in a kind of British English kind of environment. And there's something quite striking about that when one arrives there, how the essence of a kind of English country garden in this very Victorian setting could house this memorial of this European figure. So, as Rosa Godrej already mentioned, this house was the final home of Sigmund Freud and his daughter Anna Freud. And Anna Freud was an important figure in the development of child psychoanalysis. She invented the field of child psychoanalysis, and she lived in this house till her death. And before she died, she asked for this house to be turned into a museum. And that happened in 1986. 40 years or so after her father had actually died. But the reason that this museum is located in London, in this particular space, tells a very interesting and crucial story of Sigmund Freud's life. If we go back to our timeline, you can see that Sigmund Freud was actually born in a place called Freiburg in Moravia, which was then located in the Austrian Empire. And it's now called Pribor in the Czech Republic. So you can get a sense of how history has impacted all of these kind of geographies, how people move around, but also places change their names, change where they're located in various places. So he was actually born in this town called Freiburg, which is now in the Czech Republic. And he was born into a religious Jewish family, and the family moved to Vienna, which was obviously also part of the center of the Austrian Empire, in 1860 when Freud was 3. And he then goes on to go to university in Vienna. He starts university at a very young age, at the age of 17, and he trained as a medical doctor. After his training as a medical doctor, he was particularly interested in neuroscience and neuropathology. He spent some time in Paris studying under the renowned neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot, who at that time was a pioneer in the study of hysteria, what was then called hysteria. And Freud began to develop his experimental practice and theory of psychoanalysis at that time in Paris. So up until that point, he'd been a conventional medical doctor, and then he started to work with these patients on hysteria, and he begins to develop his own experimental practices. He returns to Vienna, and it's there between 1891 to 1938 that he lives in this famous, now famous, address, Berggasse 19, which we'll be talking about in a minute. And he lived there, as I say, to the very end of his life, until 1938, when Adolf Hitler annexed Austria, and as a Jew, Freud and his family were forced into exile, so they had to move to London. So this home that we've seen was his final home, but he only lived there for 1 year before he died. He developed mouth cancer many years before, in fact, and he suffered terribly with mouth cancer over a period of about 20 years. But by the time he came to London, he was already in quite a terrible state. But he still managed to practice, and we'll see he published his final works from London, from this house. And what was really unusual at that time was that for many Jewish families who had to flee their homes, many of them were quite well off, very educated, often had acquired art and were part of a kind of network of artists and so on and so forth. Very unusually, Freud was allowed to keep his possessions, and in particular his collection of artworks and antiquities. And the reason why that was possible for him was because he was, by that time, already a massive celebrity. When he moved to London, the Times had as one of its headlines that Freud was moving to London. So he was, and there's news footage from the time. So we can see that he had an enormous celebrity during his own lifetime, and in particular, the fact that he was able to bring his possessions with him and his very, very valuable collection of antiquities that I'm going to be talking to you about was facilitated by his famous patients, including at that time a woman called Marie Bonaparte, who was distantly related to Napoleon Bonaparte, but was herself the Princess George of Greece and Denmark. So she'd married into a royal family. So he had truly royal connections. And that is one of the reasons why he was able to keep possession of his artworks. So Freud moves to London with this, as I say, this enormous collection of antiquities, numbering about 3,000, which I will talk to you about in a minute. So when we talk about the Freud Museum, we're actually talking about several spaces. We're talking about this museum in London. But because this was not the only place that Freud developed his thought, in fact, only a very small part of his thought, we're also talking, about this building, which is the second Freud Museum, which is located in Vienna. And this museum in Vienna, the Freud Museum Vienna, was actually pre-existed the museum in London. And this is where, as I mentioned before, Berggasse 19, where Freud spent a very substantial part of his career, where he set up his family life, this was where really the birth of psychoanalysis took place, and so there was a desire to turn this space also into a museum. The paradox of this museum, however, is that, as we can see from this slide, which was taken from London, I'm sorry it's a little fuzzy, for the reason that I mentioned before, because Freud was able to take his possessions with him to London, this museum in Vienna, which should have been the kind of site for commemoration for the development of psychoanalysis, is in fact almost completely empty, because everything moved with him to London. So you can see that they've sort of made a virtue of their emptiness. they're these kind of very clean lines and light open spaces, which contrast very distinctly with what you'll see from his museum, the museum in London. And they've really sort of decided to turn the museum into a place of reflection, not just about the development of psychoanalysis, but also about the history of the Freuds and the necessity of their exile, right? So talking a little bit about the history of Austria and Vienna and the significance of the kind of Nazi annexation of Vienna and the suffering and persecution of the Jews at the time. So the museum in Vienna performs several functions. It commemorates the kind of birthplace of psychoanalysis, but also is a museum which commemorates Sigmund Freud and other Jews' exile. The interesting thing in relation to the kind of emptiness of the Vienna Museum is that the first kind of act of curation before the establishment of any museums in relation to Freud took place at the time that the Freuds were forced into exile. So there was a figure called Edmund Engelmann, who, hearing that the Freuds were another Jewish figure living in Vienna, a famous photographer at the time, hearing that the Freuds were being forced into exile, he actually came to Berggasse 19, to this space, and took a series, over 100 photographs of the space in Vienna, of the Freudian, of Sigmund Freud's house, its domestic areas, but also his famous consulting room, his study, the waiting room, and so on and so forth. So here we can see some of Edmund Engelmann's photos. The first one here you can see is the same image as here, where you've got the 19 above the door, but this shows you, I think it was this, was it? Yes, here. We can see here a Nazi swastika. So this was when the Nazis had already commandeered this building, and you can see that they had left their mark here in that action. And Sigmund Freud's daughter, Anna Freud, Sigmund had been very reluctant to go into exile, but his daughter, Anna Freud, had been interrogated by the Gestapo, and they were worried that she wouldn't come back. And it was after that they were finally persuaded that they needed to leave Vienna. So that's the outside of the building. Here we have Freud's desk, complete, as you can see, with many antiquities. And this is the desk today in London. So we can see that from these photos, but also because Freud himself, during his lifetime, insisted, he was able to kind of recreate his workspace exactly from Vienna to London. So this is now the desk in Vienna and the desk in London. Here, another view of the desk. And so what's interesting is you've got Freud writing his kind of medical notes, or his notes from his his analytic sessions, and he's looking over in the background here is the couch, right? And he's looking over his antiquities towards his patients, right? And you will see as another feature that I'm going to mention, but the extraordinarily diversity of the figures on his desk, the different antiquities represented here. So here are some more images from Vienna, and what one can begin to see is it's not just the desk. I mean, this is the desk in front of us here, but you can see in cabinets all over the place that the place was absolutely packed with antiquities. That was how his decor in his consulting room, that was the form that his consulting room took. This is one of the domestic spaces that was commemorated, and you can see a slight difference, actually. This is much more of a kind of high bourgeois kind of living space, not so crowded with these antiquities. And so there is quite a distinction between the domestic spaces and the workspaces of Freud. He didn't keep antiquities in the other part of the house. They were completely interlinked, but he almost like he had a sanctum where he saw his patients, and in that sanctum he kept these antiquities. And here is that sanctum. We have here the very famous couch of Sigmund Freud, but as you can see, antiquities all around it. Be they little figurines and statuettes, but also pictures, an ancient Greek stele, and so forth. And here we are back in London, where we can see the couch from a different angle, but you can see that while there are a few subtle differences, the same kinds of setup has been maintained in London. And this is another couch in Vienna, which is not the famous couch, and it's really here just to show how the Vienna Museum is a museum about absence. It's about the lack of the real couch, right? You have a substitute couch here, not the real couch. So here we have the director of the Freud Museum in Vienna explaining this double function of the museum in Vienna that I was talking about before. On the one hand, the museum is the original birthplace of psychoanalysis, and on the second hand, it is a memorial for the Holocaust, the Shoah. So this idea that they would use this space, on the one hand, as I say, to commemorate and to celebrate the development of psychoanalytic theories of Freud, but also to mark the importance of the fact that the Freud Museum had to relocate to London, and it speaks to this absence of Freud and his objects because of the kind of historical violence of the Second World War. So there is in fact a third museum of Freud, which I'm now going to talk about. If we go back to our original slide, we are now going to travel further back in time, if you like. So we've started with the Freud Museum in London, which was the last year of his life. This museum is located in Pribor in the Czech Republic. This is Freud's birthplace. And this was, in fact, the last museum to be established. It was only set up in 2006. And this is also a museum of complete absence. All we know, really, is that Freud and his family lived here at the time of Freud's birth, and that they lived there for 3 years, and then they moved away from this building, but they've decided to commemorate Freud's birthplace in this museum. Interesting, as you can see, it's pretty empty. There's not very much in this museum. And here we have a kind of reconstruction of the couch. This is not the real couch, and there's a reconstruction of the couch. And the couch plays a very important role in this kind of, iconography of Freud. But here it's an iconography which represents its absence rather than its presence. Outside, the kind of emblem of the museum is a bronze couch. So we can see this kind of traveling couch being displayed here. And the museum only actually, so it's got some fakery, but the only actual object that it possesses, which has a real relationship to Freud, is one of Freud's early childhood books. So a collection of fairy tales that Freud apparently read as a child, but the book was a donation to the museum from one of Freud's grandchildren, obviously much later in time. So it's another museum of kind of absence that we have here. And here in a recent book, we have the academic Leonard talking about this notion of these kind of, if you like, a kind of palimpsest of museums or a proliferation of museums which try to reconstruct or retell the story of Freud in this very kind of fractured way. She writes, the Freud museums in London and Vienna, this person doesn't talk about Pribourg, which is the third museum, take up the collaborative project of sustaining the Freudian legacy. The Freud museums mobilize reparative objects to compensate for the loss of the father to cancer and exile. These efforts at restitution show that the non-human object has a privileged relation to reparation. It may even be a vital form that reparation takes. The Sigmund Freud Museum in Vienna consecrates photos of Freud's residence as it appeared in 1938, before his forced departure, and the Freud Museum in London fetishizes Freud's couch and Antiquities, which trailed the ailing psychoanalyst to his adopted home. These endeavors to restore a sense of untroubled intactness indicate how the psychic life of things can function ultimately as a mediation of death that helps one endure loss and enables continued survival. So this is partly a reflection of what the point of a museum is. How do we use objects to try and deal with absence in some ways? And this is a particularly important question, I think, for a discussion of Freud and museums devoted to the development of psychoanalysis, because psychoanalysis as a practice is meant to not really leave a trace. If you think about the kind of psychoanalytic session, it's this intimate and private conversation between a doctor and their patients. Unlike other kind of medical sciences where you might have, medical apparatus and something to display in a museum, psychoanalysis doesn't really leave any objects as a trace. It was called the talking cure. It's meant to have happened in this sort of intangible relationship between Freud and his patients, and therefore it would be problematic to think of it as kind of leaving a trace in a kind of curatable sort of a way. So there is, beyond this whole history of exile and movement and all of those kinds of questions, there is a kind of further question about what would you put in a museum devoted to psychoanalysis. Thankfully, Freud did leave us many objects, right? Despite this idea that the psychoanalytic practice doesn't leave a trace. What Freud did leave us were his Antiquities, and that is basically what is left in the museum, is these 3,000 Antiquities that Freud collected during his lifetime. So we know that Freud started to collect Antiquities after the death of his father in 1896. And this is interestingly when after he'd spent time in Paris, when he begins to really develop his theory of psychoanalysis. It was in the wake of the death of his father that he starts to work on the book that becomes The Interpretation of Dreams, which is the first major psychoanalytic work of Freud. So exactly the same time that he's developing those ideas, he starts to collect Antiquities. And he doesn't tell us very much about why. He tells us a lot about all sorts of things, but he doesn't ever sort of self-interrogate about why it was that he decided that he was going to collect all of these objects. But we do know that he was incredibly attached to his collection. We have letters that document this, and they do occasionally appear in his works, his reflections on individual items in his collection. What is really striking, that I've already mentioned about his collection, is how many different cultures are represented in it. So here we have a a Jewish object, an object of Jewish devotion, which is very interesting because Freud was a very secular figure. He came from a religious Jewish family, but he rejected religion almost completely. His wife was a little bit more religious than him, but he forbade her from celebrating Jewish holidays. So it's quite interesting that in his collection he actually had a ritual object. This is a Hanukkah, which you use at the Jewish festival of Hanukkah. So he's got a few Jewish objects. He has an Indian object, and this was a gift to Freud for his 75th birthday, and it was gifted to him by the Indian Psychoanalytic Society. And Freud was particularly fond of this statuette of Vishnu, and it was on his desk. I'll come back to it in a minute, but it was on his desk, and he wrote very imperiously that he gave it a place of honor to symbolize the conquest of psychoanalysis in foreign lands. So the imperial overtones there, I think, are not incidental. I think Freud was a figure of his time in many ways, and he had very kind of colonial attitudes in some ways. And actually, the provenance and of his collection is quite dubious. You know, the way in which he was able to have access to all of these objects was very much a product of colonialism and a very unregulated antiques market at the time. So there are all sorts of problems about how Freud acquired this collection in various ways, but it was again very much the practice of the time. But there are things obviously to say about the kind of colonial dimension. So that these are some. Sorry. I seem to have, sorry, I went over this. This is a Mesopotamian object. But he also had Aztec objects, Japanese, Chinese, so really large numbers of cultures represented. Now, when one thinks about Freud and antiquity, one's mind might automatically go to the figure who's particularly associated with Freud, and this is the figure of Oedipus from Greek myth, right? Also very importantly made famous by the tragedy of Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, which Freud read as a child, translated as part of his education in the high school, in the gymnasium. So he was very, very familiar with this Greek myth and with the literature that gave birth to it. And this is obviously key to the development of Freudian thinking. The Oedipus complex, the story about Oedipus, who unwittingly kills his father and marries his mother, becomes a kind of central theory in Freud's work. And so it's not surprising that Freud had several objects which relate to that story. And here we have a picture, a reproduction of a picture by the French neoclassical painter Jean-Dominique Ingres, which Freud had hanging at the foot of his couch, right at the foot of his couch. If I've got time later, I'll show you where it is. So this was one object. Here it is, sorry. It's very small, but this was where this reproduction was positioned. And there's a kind of whole joke around feet here, because as you can see, the feet are very prominent in this picture. There's a foot down here. The name Oedipus in Greek means swollen feet. So the fact that he put it at the foot of his couch is part of that whole punning around feet. So we have here Freud's famous reproduction of Oedipus, but he also had a Greek vase which represented Oedipus too. And what's interesting is that all of these images of Oedipus represent him in his encounter with the Sphinx. And Freud was interested in the Sphinx too. He had, this is a Roman Sphinx that he had in his possession too. And one of the things that I became interested in was that it's quite clear from Freud's writing that he was fascinated with Greece and Rome, right? This was part of his education. I've already said that he studied Sophocles at school. He translated a huge amount of Greek at school, and this was part of a very kind of established Western education at the time, that you'd be highly schooled in Latin and Greek. And it's very clear from Freud's writing, all over his writing, he makes references to Greece and Rome. It forms an incredibly important part of the development of his thinking, not just through the Oedipus complex, but it also was also mentioned through things like the notion of narcissism. That comes from another Greek myth. So the presence of Greece and Rome is very obvious in Freud's writing. What I think is more interesting is that if you look at the kind of visual presence in Freud's consulting room, in Freud's workspace, actually Greece plays a role, but Egypt is much more prominent. And so if we think about this encounter between Freud and the Sphinx, what has kind of been left out in many analyses of Freud and his interest in antiquity is the Sphinx as a representative of Egypt, right? The Greeks associated the Sphinx with Egypt. And of Freud's 3,000 antiquities, the largest number of them came from Egypt. Around 700 objects of his came from Egypt, and I think we can see it again here. If we look at over his couch, this is a picture of Abu Simbel in Egypt. These Roman portraits are actually Egyptian Roman portraits. So Egypt plays a really, really fundamental role in the kind of visual space of his. We've got a camel here. So if you actually sort of think about Egypt, it's the kind of culture that's hiding in plain sight in Freud's imaginary. So I want to think about what one can, what changes in our perception of Freud if we pay attention to his Egyptian objects. How does one change one's perception of what Freud was interested in if one focuses on his Egyptian objects? How does one use his collection and what's left in his museum to try and understand what was going on in his thinking better? And I think there are three areas where it will change our perception. The first is sexuality, the second is understanding of archaeology, and the third is his religious and ethnic identity. So here are just some of the objects that some of Freud's nicest Egyptian objects. This is Amon-Ra, this is Isis, this is the picture of Abu Simbel, which was above his couch. Lots of objects related to death and mummification. I've visited the gorgeous mummy that you have, the only mummy apparently in Mumbai, in the room right next door to this one just before. But Freud owned many, some mummy faces and some bandages. He was fascinated with the kind of Egyptian rituals around death. So these are some of Freud's Egyptian objects. And Freud, I think, very much reflected in as we've already said, some of the kind of passions of his period and the wider Egyptomania of the period. So he's working, as I said, in the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and throughout the 19th century, there'd been the emergence of a new form of Egyptomania and interest in Egypt. And here we have Napoleon in the early part of the 19th century, and his conquest of Egypt, which became part of this European fascination with Egypt, of which Freud is part. But here what's interesting is we have Napoleon facing the Sphinx at Giza. Freud also has an etching of the Sphinx of Giza in his consulting room, so he was obviously interested in him. And what's quite fascinating is that the Egyptians tended to think of the Sphinx as a male figure. If we go back to this image of the Sphinx, definitely not male, right? Very much a figure, a representation of the Sphinx which emphasizes her sensuality, but in particular her female sensuality. So the Greeks tended to think of the Sphinx as a female figure. The Egyptians were not completely consistent on it, but they mainly represented the Sphinx as male. And we find an element of a kind of more Egyptian Sphinx, I think, in Freud, who also seems to interpret the Sphinx as male. So this is his discussion of Oedipus, and he says the hero Oedipus commits the deed patricide unintentionally and apparently uninfluenced by the woman. This latter element is, however, taken into account in the circumstances that the hero can only obtain possession of the queen mother after he's repeated his deed upon the monster who symbolizes the father. So this is Freud's interpretation of the encounter of Oedipus and the Sphinx, and he says that the moment that Oedipus overturns the Sphinx is a kind of symbolic recurring of the violence that he commits against his father in order to possess his mother. So in order for Oedipus to marry his mother, he first needs to overcome the Sphinx, which is a repetition of him killing his father in order to then be able to marry his mother. So we have here an interesting kind of model where, despite these kind of very female sphinxes that appear in Freud's visual imaginary, in his writing he takes this more Egyptian version of the Sphinx, where the Sphinx symbolizes a male figure. And I think this is very much part of the when one thinks about Freud and the problems with a lot of Freud's theories of sexuality, in particular his Oedipus complex, the dominance of the father in his stories, the extent to which he marginalizes the figure of the mother in his writing. But what's interesting is, despite this moment, if we look at where Egypt does appear in Freud's writing, it seems repeatedly to return him to the figure of the mother. It seems to be where he enables himself, or he allows himself to reflect on the importance of the mother in the development of child psychology. So I mentioned before that Freud's first major work of psychoanalysis, The Interpretations of Dreams, was written about the same time as he starts collecting all of these objects. There does seem to have been so he starts collecting most of his objects after his father dies, most of his Egyptian objects after his mother dies, interestingly. So in Interpretation of Dreams, he says, it's a rare occasion where he talks about one of his own dreams. And he says there, "It is dozens of years since I myself had a true anxiety dream, but I remember one from my 7th or 8th year, which I submitted to interpretation some 30 years later. It was a very vivid one, and in it I saw my beloved mother, with a peculiarly peaceful sleeping expression on her features, being carried into a room by 2 or 3 people with bird beaks and laid upon the bed. I awoke in tears and screaming and interrupted my parents' sleep. The strangely draped and unnaturally tall figures with birds' beaks were derived from illustrations to the Philipson Bible. I fancy they must have been gods with falcons' heads from an ancient Egyptian funerary relief." And here we have the reference to the Philipson Bible. This was the Freud's family Bible. So I told you, I mentioned that Freud was brought up in quite a religious family, and this was the family Bible. And here it was a richly illustrated Bible, and it had lots of images of these Egyptian falcon-headed gods. So Freud was referencing this family Bible and talking about the reappearance of his mother in his dreams, and we can see here also a connection to death, right? So he's talking about how he saw his mother sleeping, but he is relating it to a funerary relief. So here we have the kind of mother reappearing in Freud's writing in the guise of a kind of Egyptian context. This association between the mother, Egypt, and the child also returns in Freud's, what he called his psychobiography of the figure Leonardo da Vinci. And he starts his story of the biography of the artist Leonardo da Vinci with this anecdote that Leonardo, which comes from Leonardo himself. He says, Da Vinci is meant to have said, "It seems that I was always destined to be so deeply concerned with vultures, for I recall as one of my very earliest memories that while I was in my cradle, a vulture came down to me and opened my mouth with its tail and struck me many times with its tail against my lips." So Freud, I can sort of see why Freud was interested in this anecdote that Leonardo is meant to have told, and he connects it to the figure of the Egyptian falcon-headed god Mut, He talks about Mut as being this very ambiguous figure in Egyptian mythology, a figure represented as female, but sometimes, not in this is one of Freud's objects, but not in this case, but sometimes represented with a phallus. And he associates, in his biography of Leonardo, he associates the figure of this falcon-headed goddess with the idea of what he termed the phallic mother, the kind of overbearing mother, the mother who wanted to take both the role of the mother and the father. He associates this figure with this Egyptian god Mut, and he mentions that the hieroglyph for this goddess, Mut, is the same hieroglyph for mother. And he further makes the joke that in German, the word for mother is Mutter, which sounds a bit like moot. So he makes all of these kind of different associations. But here the mother is a kind of threatening figure. If you go back to this anecdote, this idea that the mouth, this is meant to be the scene of nursing, but it's a kind of violent scene of nursing. The idea of the tail being inserted into the infant's mouth in this way. And it becomes part of his whole discussion of the emergence of Leonardo's creativity and how his creativity is linked to his sexuality in various ways and the role of the mother in the development of Leonardo's sexuality. So that's the first way in which I think we can connect Freud and Egypt to a different vision of Freud, where the figure of the mother comes to play a more prominent role. The second way that I think it plays a very significant role was the development of archaeology at the time, in particular Egyptian archaeology. This is the figure of Flinders Petrie, who was the first professor of Egyptology in the UK. He was a professor of Egyptology at my own university, at University College London, and he was associated with quite significant developments in what we would now call scientific archaeology. He developed this idea of stratification, which was a way of dating before carbon dating. So these were kind of big strides in development of kind of a more scientific approach to archaeology, the dating of objects. But more broadly, what became a significant part of Freud's interest in a figure like Flinders Petrie was the idea that archaeology had a kind of analogous relationship to psychoanalysis. In his very earliest writings about psychoanalysis, Freud thinks about how he could develop a metaphor of archaeology for understanding hysteria. And in particular, he wanted to understand the relationship between the conscious and the unconscious mind. And for him, archaeology became a key way of making sense of the layers of the mind and how conscious thoughts interact with buried unconscious memories. And in a few passages here, you can see how, from his earliest work, Freud uses archaeology to try and talk about that, a new approach to the mind. He writes here, in the face of incompleteness of my analytic results, I had no choice but to follow the example of those whose good fortune it is to bring to light of day after their long burial the priceless though mutilated relics of antiquity. I have restored what is missing, taking the best model known to me from other analyses, but like the conscientious archaeologist, I have not omitted to mention each case where the authentic part ends and my construction begins. So he relates memories here to the mutilated relics of antiquity. He's searching for memories in people's minds in the same way that archaeologists are searching for objects. And you have here a different way of thinking about it. Thus it came about that in this, the first full-length analysis of hysteria undertaken by me, I arrived at a procedure which I later developed into a regular method and employed deliberately. This procedure was one of clearing away the pathogenic psychical material layer by layer, and we like to compare it to the technique of excavating a buried city. So here he shows how psychoanalysis develops its methods in analogy to archaeology, where you're excavating the mind. You're trying to get through the different layers of the mind to get to the kind of relics at its bottom. And here, the reference to the buried city, I think, is particularly significant because the figure of Flinders Petrie that I mentioned a minute ago was very famous in the late 19th century for having discovered a buried city in Egypt, the city of Amarna, which was the head of the kingdom of the pharaoh Akhenaten, the figure of Akhenaten, who was this heretic pharaoh who was thought to have developed a monotheistic religion. So this was a massive discovery at the time. Obviously, Egypt associated with polytheism, but the figure of Akhenaten, we think, began to think about the development of a kind of more monotheistic religion. And he was, there was such a kind of reaction to him that his city was deliberately destroyed, and his memory was erased from the record. And it was with Flinders Petrie's rediscovery of Amarna that people became fascinated in this figure of Akhenaten. And here we have Freud. Sorry, this is the figure of Akhenaten with his wife Nefertiti from the Petrie Museum in London. And here we have Freud in his final work, Moses and Monotheism, talking about this discovery of Flinders Petrie. Amenhotep is the fourth is another name for Akhenaten. So he says Amenhotep's reign lasted only 17 years. Soon after his death in 1358 BCE, right? The new religion was swept away, and the memory of this heretic king prescribed. From the ruins of this new capital dedicated to his god, and from the rock tomb inscriptions belonging to it, we derive the little knowledge we possess of him. All we learn of this remarkable, unique person is of great interest. So this is Freud in his final work, published from London, reacting directly to this archaeological discovery of this buried city and of the figure of Akhenaten. And Freud is writing from exile in London, what he called himself a godless Jew. He'd rejected Jewish religion his entire life, and right at the end of his life, he writes a book about Moses and the development of monotheism. And to Freud, this discovery of a monotheism which predated Judaism, so at the time Judaism was considered to be, by most people, the first monotheism. The fact that we found in this figure of Akhenaten a figure who predated Judaism arose suspicions for Freud, who was a kind of very suspicious mind, and he decided to make the claim, which was incredibly controversial at the time, that Moses was not a Jew, but an Egyptian, that he was a follower of Akhenaten, and he makes this claim in this famous book, Moses and Monotheism, written at the very end of his life. Now, this is a particularly contentious thing for him to have done in 1938, when the book was published, at a time when Jews were being persecuted, and he's arguing here that Moses was not a Jewish figure, but an Egyptian figure. And so one can ask oneself, what was he doing? I think what he was doing is something that's reflected in his entire collection. What he's interested in is the interaction of ancient cultures, the exchange between cultures. And although at one level it was a very provocative, and some people found it a very problematic thing to do, for him to argue that Moses was not an was not a Jew but an Egyptian, I think what he was trying to do was to express was the complexity of cultures, the importance of the exchange between cultures, and he was rejecting Nazi ideology at the time, which was all about racial, religious, and ethnic purity. Instead, he was arguing that these figures are composite figures. They're figures who draw on different cultures simultaneously. And in that way, I think Freud is a precursor of the excellent work that's being done by many people today, and in particular by this museum, thinking about how one might curate a kind of global antiquity. And that's what I learned. Thank you.